At my father's 70th birthday gala, amidst the ice sculptures and forced applause, he announced that we were selling sterling and stone because the market had changed. My siblings, Brian and Caitlin, cheered, already spending the money in their heads. I stood still, a charcoal shadow against the glitz. I smiled and asked who the buyer was. He proudly said it was Apex Horizon and that they were paying $120 million. I laughed and told him that I am Apex Horizon. The room went silent. Drop a comment and let me know if you've ever held onto a secret that you knew would change everything once it came out. I'd love to hear your stories. I watched the color drain from my father's face. It started at his jaw, clenched tight enough to crack a tooth, and washed up to his hairline. Andrew Sterling, the titan of Chicago architecture, the man who built skyscrapers just to see his own name touch the clouds, was speechless. My brother Brian stopped mid-cheer, his champagne glass halfway to his mouth. My sister Caitlin just blinked, her phone still recording, broadcasting her own humiliation to her 50,000 followers. It was the silence I'd been waiting for my entire life. To understand why I didn't feel a shred of guilt. You have to understand the architecture of my family. In the Sterling blueprint, I was a load-bearing wall. Essential, but meant to be covered up. I'm Maria. I'm 32. And for as long as I can remember, I've been the invisible daughter. My father, Andrew, built sterling and stone on a foundation of ego and concrete. He loved steel. He loved height. He loved anything that shouted dominance at the skyline. He didn't care about how a building breathed, or how the people inside it lived. He just wanted it big. Brian, my older brother, was the heir apparent. Not because he had talent. He didn't. But because he was loud, male, and willing to gamble with other people's money. He was 38, flashy, and had the kind of confidence that only comes from never having faced a real consequence in your life. Then there was Caitlin, 29, an interior design influencer who thought structural integrity was a buzzkill. She cared about aesthetics, about the veneer. She was perfect for my father's world. And me, I was the anomaly. I didn't want to build monuments to myself. I wanted to build green lungs for the city. Sustainable urban planning. Parks that filtered rainwater. Buildings that generated their own power. When I graduated top of my class with a master's in sustainable design, I thought, naively, that my father would be proud. I brought my portfolio to his office. It was a proposal for a mixed-use development that would have revitalized a dying neighborhood on the south side. He flipped through 2 pages. Just 2. Then he tossed it onto his desk like it was a takeout menu. He told me that this was gardening, that we were architects who built legacies, and that we didn't plant vegetables. But it wasn't just dismissal. It was sabotage. I started applying for internships at rival firms. Good firms. Places that respected innovation. I got interviews. They went great. Then, silence. Rejection after rejection. It didn't make sense until I ran into a hiring manager at a mixer. He'd had a few drinks. He whispered that my father had called and told the partners that hiring me would be seen as an act of aggression against Sterling and Stone. He said I needed to learn loyalty. Loyalty. He wasn't teaching me loyalty. He was teaching me that my talent was a threat. He was ensuring that the only place I could ever work was under his thumb. Grateful for scraps. That night, I realized something terrifying. My father didn't ignore my potential because he couldn't see it. He ignored it because seeing it would mean admitting that his way, the ego, the dominance, the concrete, was obsolete. It's a classic narcissist's blind spot. To acknowledge my genius, He would have to acknowledge his own irrelevance. And Andrew Sterling would rather burn down the building than admit the foundation was cracked. So I did the only logical thing. I disappeared. I founded Apex Horizon, under a pseudonym. I started with nothing but a laptop and a grudge. I built my empire in the dark, knowing that one day, I would own the light. I poured everything I had into Apex. While Brian was throwing money at risky commercial properties that would sit empty, and Caitlin was curating her Instagram feed, I was living in a studio apartment the size of a walk-in closet. My diet consisted of instant noodles and sheer willpower. Every cent I saved went back into the business. Every waking hour was dedicated to proving that sustainability wasn't just a trend. It was the future. My first big win wasn't a skyscraper. It was a municipal contract to redesign a failing drainage system in a flood-prone district. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't sexy. But it worked. And it got me noticed. Slowly. Quietly. Apex Horizon grew. We took on bigger projects. We hired the best young minds. The ones Sterling and Stone ignored. We became the invisible force reshaping the city from the ground up. And then, I started watching my father's firm. I didn't need insider information to see the cracks. They were public record if you knew where to look. Sterling and Stone was bleeding money. Their legacy projects were over budget and behind schedule. Their debt was mounting. So, I started buying. I set up shell companies with names like Greenfield Ventures and Urban Renewal Partners. Piece by piece, I acquired their distressed assets. I bought the loans they couldn't service. I bought the liens on their properties. It wasn't malice. It was structural support. I was reinforcing the very building my father was letting crumble. Becoming the silent partner he never knew he had. Back at the gala, the silence stretched. Heavy and suffocating. My father finally tried to laugh. A brittle, hollow sound. He looked around at the guests as if sharing a private joke and told me I was confused. That Apex was a holding company. A serious firm. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply reached into my clutch and pulled out a stack of documents. I placed the deed of sale gently on the table next to his untouched cake, along with the articles of incorporation for Apex Horizon, inviting him to check the signature on the bottom line. The room watched as he picked up the papers. His hands were shaking. Brian stepped forward, trying to salvage the moment with his usual bluster, telling Dad not to listen to me, claiming he brokered the deal and knew the people involved were foreign investors. I turned to my brother and asked if that was what he told Dad. I pulled out a second stack of papers and revealed that, according to them, the consulting fees he paid to secure this deal went to a shell company in Macau, registered to him. The gasps were audible this time. I told him it wasn't just a buyout. It was an audit. I knew about the $2.5 million he siphoned off. I knew about the gambling debts. I knew everything. Brian went pale. The confident smirk he'd worn for 38 years vanished, replaced by the terrified look of a child caught with his hand in the jar. My father looked from the papers to his son, then to me. The realization was dawning, slow and painful. The daughter he'd ignored had become the titan he pretended to be. The son he'd anointed was the thief who had almost destroyed him. And the empire he thought he was selling, it had already been conquered. My father stared at the papers, his chest heaving. For a second, I thought he might actually have a heart attack right there in the middle of the ballroom. But Andrew Sterling was made of tougher stuff than that. He straightened his spine, summoning every ounce of his legendary arrogance. He hissed that I couldn't do this, that he would cancel the deal, find another buyer, and burn the company to the ground before letting me steal it from him. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just looked at him with a strange kind of pity. I told him he couldn't cancel the deal because he wasn't selling the company to me, he was surrendering it. I pulled out the final document. It was a single sheet of paper, heavy and cream-colored. I explained that it was a summary of Sterling and Stone's current debt obligations. The loans he took out to finance the Millennium Tower, the credit lines he maxed out to cover payroll last year, and the personal guarantees he signed. He snatched the paper from my hand. I told him I owned them all. I bought his distressed debt 6 months ago when the bank was preparing to foreclose. I'd been holding the notes ever since. Caitlin gasped and asked what that meant. I turned to my sister and told her it meant I could have foreclosed on the company at any time. I could have taken everything. The buildings, the brand, the assets. For $0. I could have left them all with nothing but their debts. I looked back at my father. He was reading the document, his eyes darting back and forth as the reality of his situation set in. I continued, telling him that I didn't. I was offering him $120 million. Not because I had to. Not because the company was worth it. But because I was choosing to be merciful. This was the moment I had dreaded and craved in equal measure. The power flip. For years, I had been the one begging for validation. For a chance. For a seat at the table. Now, I owned the table. And yet, looking at him, this man who had loomed so large in my life, who had made me feel so small, I didn't feel triumph. I felt tired. He whispered, asking why I would pay. Why I wouldn't just take it. I told him it was because, unlike him, I didn't need to destroy someone to feel powerful. I was paying him because I wanted him to know, unequivocally, that my success was real, that I built something he couldn't, and that I was choosing to save him from his own failure. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. I told him this money was the price of my freedom. It was the severance package for our relationship. He should take it, retire to Florida, and be grateful I was a better architect of my life than he ever was of his. I watched him struggle. I saw the war in his eyes. The pride fighting against the desperation. He looked at Brian, who was staring at the floor, defeated. He looked at Caitlin, who was frantically typing on her phone, probably trying to spin this disaster into content. Then he looked at me. Really looked at me. Maybe for the first time. He picked up a pen from the table. His hand shook. Not with age, but with the realization of his own obsolescence. He signed the deed of sale. The scratch of the pen on paper sounded like a gavel falling. I took the document back and told him it was done. Sterling and Stone was mine. I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving the ice sculptures to melt and the champagne to go warm. I left my family in the ruins of their own ego, and I stepped out into the cool Chicago night. For the first time in my life, the city skyline didn't look like a wall. It looked like a canvas. And I was holding the brush. My father sat in the VIP room. The signed documents on the table in front of him. The sound of the pen scratching against the paper had been quiet, but it echoed with the finality of a gavel. The guests were gone, ushered out by nervous staff. It was just us now. The Sterling family, dismantled and laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the private suite. He looked at his hands, still shaking slightly. For the first time in my life, I saw him not as a titan, but as an old man. A man who had built his entire identity on a foundation that had just crumbled. He asked roughly what happened next. I told him that now. He retired. He would move to the condo in Florida like he'd been threatening to do for years. He would play golf. He would tell everyone he sold the company for a fortune because he was ready to enjoy his golden years. I wouldn't contradict him. He nodded slowly. It was a lifeline. A way to save face. and he grabbed it with the desperation of a drowning man. I turned to Brian. He was slumped in a chair, his head in his hands. I hardened my voice and told him there would be no golden parachute. He was removed from the company effective immediately. Brian looked up, panic in his eyes, pleading that he had debts. I told him I knew. And I wasn't pressing charges. That was my gift to him. But in exchange, he was going to rehab for the gambling. And he was going to counseling. He was going to fix himself. Or I would let the district attorney see those ledgers. It was an offer of mercy he didn't deserve, but one I needed to give. Not for him, but for me, to prove that I wasn't just conquering them. I was correcting them. Caitlin, sensing the shift in power, tried to pivot. She wiped her eyes, checking her reflection in her phone screen. She asked if this meant we could collaborate, saying she had great ideas for rebranding the firm's interiors and could do a whole sustainable luxury series for her channel. I looked at her. At the superficiality that ran so deep, it was structural. I told her no. She didn't get to attach her brand to my work. If she wanted to be a designer, she needed to go to school. She needed to learn the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition and build her own portfolio. Until then, she needed to stay away from my firm. She gasped. Affronted. But I didn't care. I was done enabling their delusions. My father stood up, leaning heavily on the table. He looked at me. Really looked at me. With a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He murmured that I was tougher than he thought. I replied that I had to be. I was built by sterling and stone. He flinched at the double meaning, then turned and walked out of the room. A king leaving his castle for the last time. Brian and Caitlin followed, stripped of their armor, leaving me alone in the silence. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally felt mine. It was done. The demolition was complete. Now, the real work could begin. 6 months later, I walked into the penthouse office that had once been my father's fortress. The heavy mahogany desk was gone, replaced by a sleek, reclaimed wood table. The velvet curtains that had blocked the view were stripped away, letting the Chicago sunlight flood the room. The firm was now Apex Sterling. I kept part of the name, not out of nostalgia, but out of respect for the history it represented. We build on the past. We don't erase it. But the culture was entirely Apex. The junior architects my father had ignored were now leading teams. The sustainable design division was the heart of the company. I stood on the balcony, looking out at the skyline. The wind whipped my hair. But I didn't feel cold. I felt grounded. I thought about revenge. People always talk about revenge like it's a fire you have to feed. But my revenge wasn't burning down the house. It was buying the house, fixing the foundation, and opening the windows. Competence is the only judge that matters. You can build skyscrapers to your ego. You can shout about your legacy. You can try to bury the people who threaten your worldview. But eventually, the concrete cracks. Eventually, the debt comes due. And the one who poured the foundation, the one who did the work in the dark while everyone else was celebrating in the light, she's the one who ends up holding the keys. One of my new interns, a young woman with bright eyes and a nervous smile, called my name. She told me the planning commission was there for the waterfront proposal. I told her I was coming. I took one last look at the city. My city. I wasn't the invisible daughter anymore. I was the architect. And I had a lot of work to do. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming your power, make sure to like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what's one goal you're working on right now that you know will pay off later? I read every single one.